The men on the range laughed when she stepped up to the line. Not all of them. A few had the discipline to keep it internal, to let it live only in the sideways glance, the shoulder that turned slightly away, the careful study of something else entirely. But Sergeant First Class Dolan didn't bother with subtlety. He laughed out loud, the short, hard laugh of a man who has decided something before the evidence arrives, and he said it loud enough for the whole bay to hear. "This the sniper they sent us?" Lieutenant Clare Callahan set her rifle case on the bench, unlatched it, and said nothing. She had been on Fort Bragg for less than 4 hours. The morning had started the way mornings at new assignments always started for her, which was alone. She'd driven her own truck through the security gate, checked in with a duty clerk who looked at her credentials twice, with the specific expression of someone running a calculation that wasn't coming out right, and been pointed toward Building 7 without anyone offering to walk her there. She'd found it herself. She was good at finding things herself. She had been doing it her entire career. The 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment had been running long-range precision fire support for 11 years. In those 11 years, they had never been assigned a female sniper. They had, until 48 hours ago, not known they were about to be assigned one now. The order had come down from USASOC with the particular bureaucratic efficiency of something that has been decided several levels above anyone's ability to object to it, and it had landed on Major Harris's desk like a stone dropped into still water. Harris had read it twice. He was a careful man, thorough, the kind of officer who kept his opinions off his face, unless he trusted the room completely. He didn't say anything about it in the team briefing that morning. He just said a new specialist was coming in, that her assignment was related to Project Overwatch, and that she'd be integrated into assessment protocols starting Monday. He didn't say she was a woman. He hadn't needed to. The order said Lieutenant C. Callahan and Dolan, who had been in the unit for 7 years and had opinions about everything, had looked it up. Claire knew he'd looked it up. She knew, the way you know these things after enough time in institutional spaces, that her arrival had already been discussed, already been assessed, already been decided upon before she walked through the door. The only unknown was what she was going to do about it. The answer, as it had always been, was nothing yet. She was going to do the work. She lifted the rifle from the case. It was a customized .338 Lapua Magnum, built to her specifications over 2 years of modifications she'd made herself. A weapon that looked unremarkable to someone who didn't know what they were looking at and told a complete story to someone who did. She ran the bolt, checked the chamber, seated herself at the bench with the unhurried economy of someone who had done this 10,000 times in conditions that made this particular moment, this clean, dry indoor range with its fluorescent lights and its gallery of watchful men, feel almost leisurely. Dolan said something else. She didn't catch the specific words, but she caught the tone, and the tone was the same tone it had always been. She had a collection of those tones. They went back 15 years, to a high school rifle team in rural Virginia, where a girl who could outshoot every boy in the county had learned early that the thing to do with that particular sound was let it be a sound, not a signal. Sounds didn't have to mean anything unless you decided they did. She settled into the rifle. The target was 800 meters. Standard assessment distance for the unit. She'd been told this by Harris's aide, a quiet young man named Specialist Grant, who had walked her to the range and then stood slightly to the side, in the way of someone uncertain whether to stay or leave. She'd told him to stay if he wanted. He'd stayed. She worked the math in her head. Not slowly, not as a performance, just the way breathing works, automatic and complete. Wind at roughly 6 miles per hour from the northwest, reading the flags at the range entrance. Humidity and temperature affecting bullet drop. The rifle's specific ballistic profile, which she knew better than she knew her own handwriting. The calculation ran in under 4 seconds. She adjusted the turret 2 clicks. She fired. The round hit the center of the target, not close to center. Then she fired again and again. 5 rounds, same hole, which was not something most people in that room had ever seen done at 800 meters by someone who had just walked in off the road. The range went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of nothing happening, the specific quiet of a room recalibrating. Grant made a sound beside her, A small involuntary sound, the sound of someone who has just watched something exceed what they thought was possible and is revising their interior map. Dolan said nothing. She could hear the nothing of it from across the bay, which was, she had learned, a better sound than the laughing. She stripped the rifle, cased it, and turned to find Major Harris standing at the back of the range. She didn't know when he'd arrived. He was watching her with the measured expression of a man who had expected one thing and received another and was still deciding what that meant. She met his eyes. She waited. "Lieutenant Callahan," he said. "My office." 10 minutes. She picked up her case and followed him out. Harris's office was the office of a man who had been doing a serious job for a long time. It had the particular organized spareness of a space where sentimentality had been edited down to its essentials. One photograph on the desk, a folded flag in a case on the shelf, a citation on the wall that she didn't read because it wasn't her business to read it. She sat across from him and he looked at her the way experienced commanders look at things that don't fit the existing categories. "You're here for Overwatch," he said. "Yes, sir." "You know what Overwatch is." It wasn't a question, so she didn't answer it like one. Classified long-range fire support integration for mountain operations in contested environments. Specific application to a theater I'm not going to name in this room. Harris looked at her steadily. "You're not the assignment I would have requested." "I know, sir. That's not a commentary on your capability." He paused. "That round group at 800 was legitimate." "Thank you, sir. I've seen Morse's numbers." He meant Sergeant First Class Morse, the unit's current senior sniper, who had been with the detachment for 5 years and who she had not yet met. She knew his record. She knew it the way she knew the ballistic profile of her rifle. Thoroughly and from memory. "His best group at that distance is tighter than yours. By about 3 millimeters, she said, at standard conditions. His drops off in high wind above 12 miles per hour. Mine doesn't, because my calculation method accounts for turbulence interaction differently." She paused. "I'm not saying I'm better than Sergeant Morse, sir. I'm saying I solve a different part of the problem." Harris was quiet for a moment. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who is doing math of a different kind. "Overwatch needs someone who can run precision fire in conditions where standard ballistic tables fail," he said finally. "Mountain elevations above 10,000 feet, variable thermals, targets moving through partial concealment, the kind of shot where the margin is zero." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm here." Another silence. Harris looked at his desk, then back at her. "Dolan runs my range assessments," he said. "He's going to run yours too, all of them. He's been in this unit longer than anyone except Morse." She understood what he was saying and what he wasn't saying. "Understood, sir. He's going to push." "I know. If I told you not to let it bother you," Harris said. And there was something in his voice that was almost dry, almost a kind of honesty between two people who understood the situation. "I'd be wasting both our time." She almost smiled. "Then don't tell me that, sir." Harris looked at her for one more moment. Something settled in his expression. Not warmth, not yet, but something adjacent to it. The beginning of respect taking form. "Integration starts Monday," he said. "You have the weekend to get settled. Your quarters are in Building 4. He stood, which meant the meeting was over. "Don't be late Monday." She wasn't late Monday. She arrived at 05:45, which was 15 minutes before anyone else. And she spent those 15 minutes at Dolan's assessment board, reading the metrics he'd posted for the week's training schedule. Not because she needed to, but because she wanted to understand how he thought. A man's training schedule tells you what he believes about his work. Dolan believed in volume and pressure, high round count, tight time windows, sequential drills that built stress through cumulative demand. It was a legitimate methodology. It worked for a specific kind of shooter. She noted where it would fail at altitude, in cold, with a target that wasn't stationary, with a spotter who didn't share your calculation framework. She noted it without judgment, the way you note a fact. Dolan arrived at 05:58. He saw her at the board, and his expression did the thing she had expected it to do, which was tighten slightly, the micro-adjustment of a man who has decided how something is going to go and is annoyed to find the setup different from what he planned. "You're early," he said. "Yes," she said. "Assessment starts at 06:15. I know." He looked at her for a moment, at the board, back at her. She could see him deciding whether to say something else. He decided not to. He walked past her to his locker and she went and sat down and waited. The first week was a careful war, not the kind with raised voices. Those came later. This was the subtler kind, fought through scheduling and assignment, and the specific social weather of a team that has been together long enough to run on shared assumptions, and now has something in it that doesn't share those assumptions and hasn't decided yet what to do about that. Dolan put her in the worst time slots, the ones with low light, with wind from variable directions, with targets set at distances that weren't on the standard assessment matrix. She shot them anyway. She hit them. She wasn't perfect, no one is at the margins, but she was consistent in a way that couldn't be dismissed. And she was consistent in conditions where the other shooters in the rotation were dropping rounds. Morse was different from Dolan. She'd expected the senior sniper to be the harder wall, but Morse was quieter than his reputation suggested. He was a lean man in his mid-30s, with hands that were always slightly in motion, the habitual restlessness of someone who processes through physicality, and he watched her shoot on the third day without saying anything for a long time. Then he said, "Your trigger pull is asymmetric." She looked at him, not by much, but on long shots in wind, it's pulling your impact point left of your calculated POI by about half a minute of angle. You're compensating for it, which is why your groups are still good, but you're adding a variable to an equation that should be as clean as possible. She said, "I know. The compensation is built into my elevation-wind interaction calculation. It accounts for the pull bias implicitly." Morse looked at her. He looked at her the way someone looks at a thing that is organized differently from what they expected and is trying to understand the organization rather than dismiss it. "Show me the calculation," he said. She showed him. It took 40 minutes, at the table in the equipment room with a whiteboard and 2 markers. And at the end of it, Morse was quiet for a long moment, and then he said something she hadn't expected from him. He said, "I've been doing it wrong at 1,200 meters in crosswind." She looked at him. "The standard table doesn't account for the elevation-humidity interaction above 9,000 feet the way your model does. I thought my accuracy drop in mountain conditions was a mechanical issue. It's not. It's a calculation issue." She said, "It took me a year to work that out. Can I have the model?" She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. "Of course." Morse nodded slowly. Something in his posture shifted, not dramatically, the way a door opens just enough to change the pressure in a room. He picked up his coffee and said, "Dolan's going to keep pushing." "I know." He pushed the last outside assignment this unit got until the guy asked to be reassigned. She looked at the whiteboard, at the calculation written out in her own handwriting. "I'm not going to ask to be reassigned," she said. Morse said nothing, but he didn't leave the room either. On the 8th day, Dolan made his move. It came during a live fire assessment with the full team observing. Harris was there. 2 visiting observers from USASOC were there, men in their 40s with the particular compact watchfulness of people who evaluate things for a living. Callahan had been told about the assessment that morning. She had not been told about the visiting observers. She was fairly certain that was deliberate. The scenario was a moving target sequence. 3 targets at staggered distances, 900, 1100, and 1300 meters, appearing in random order with a 3-second window on each. The kind of drill designed to test the integration of rapid calculation and motor execution, the ability to transition from one distance to another without resetting the fundamental equation each time. Dolan ran Morse first. Morse was excellent. He hit 12 of 15 windows, missing only on the 2 1300 shots where the wind shifted between his calculation and his trigger press. It was a strong performance, the kind of performance that had made Morse's reputation. Then Dolan called Callahan. "Same scenario," he said. "Callahan, on the line." She settled into her position. The range went the particular quiet of people watching. She hit 14 of 15. The only miss was on a 900-meter shot where the target appeared for 2.5 seconds, not 3, which she registered but couldn't verify in the moment. She had done the math correctly. The timing had been outside the stated parameters. She noted it, said nothing, and stood up from her position. Dolan said, "Reset again." She looked at him. "The scenario was 1 run per assessor. I want a second run. The range was very quiet. She looked at Harris, who was watching with the measured expression he always wore, which gave her nothing. She looked at the USASOC observers who were watching Dolan. Second run, Dolan said again, and his voice had something in it that wasn't quite professional. It was the thing underneath professional, the thing you could feel but couldn't formally object to. She went back to the line. She hit all 15. She knew as she was shooting that she was angry. She knew it the way she always knew it, as a physical fact, a tightness in the chest that she had learned over many years, to treat as information rather than instruction. The anger told her something true. It did not get to tell her what to do. She stood up. She cased the rifle. She said nothing. After the assessment, Morse appeared beside her on the walk back to Building 7. He didn't say anything for almost 3 minutes, which was, she had come to understand his way of thinking. Then he said, "He did that because you outshot me the first run." She said, "I know. You outshot everyone here in the second run. I know." Morse was quiet again. Then, the USASOC guys, did you see their faces after the second run? She hadn't been looking at their faces. She'd been looking at the targets. No, Lieutenant Colonel Farber, Morse said. He was writing. She let that sit. He wrote for a while, Morse said. That night, in the spare quarters she'd been assigned in Building 4, Callahan sat on the edge of her bunk, with the scenario data she'd been keeping in her own log, the numbers she ran after every session, the comparative analysis she'd been building for 10 days. Not because anyone had asked for it, because she had learned a long time ago that in institutional environments, the people who survive long enough to change things are the ones who can prove what they know in language the institution understands. She had been keeping logs like this since she was 23 years old, since a situation in a different unit on a different base where the truth had been dismissed because it wasn't written down, and someone she knew had paid for that dismissal in a way she was not going to revisit in this particular moment. She closed the log. She turned off the light. She lay on her back in the dark and thought about the 15 targets and the one she'd missed and the timing that had been off, and she ran the scenario again in her head, which was what she always did, and found nothing she would change. She was ready for whatever came next. She just needed it to come. What came next was Farber. Lieutenant Colonel James Farber from USASOC arrived at Harris's office at OS and 30 the next morning and stayed for 90 minutes. Callahan knew because she walked past the office twice, and both times the door was closed, and Harris's assistant, Specialist Grant, was stationed outside it with the specific posture of someone guarding a room where something is being decided. When Harris came out, he found her at the data terminal in the operations bay and said, "My office now." She followed him in. He closed the door and sat down and looked at her with the expression he wore when he was about to say something he'd been thinking about for a while. "Farber wants a demonstration," he said. "Full precision assessment, mountain simulation parameters, the complete Overwatch scenario package. He wants it in 5 days." She absorbed that. 5 days was faster than the original integration timeline. It meant compressing 3 weeks of assessment work into one. It meant going into a high-stakes demonstration before she had fully established the team's trust in her methodology. "Is this his request or something else?" she said. Harris looked at her. His request. She thought about Dolan, about the second run, about Farber writing in his notebook. "Okay," she said. "There's more," Harris said. "Farber is specifically interested in the Overwatch problem at elevation. The shot that the existing doctrine says isn't consistently makeable. Target in partial concealment at 1,300 meters, altitude 9,000 feet, 40% humidity variance, thermal layering." He paused. "The shot Morse has been working on for 2 years. She knew the shot. She had run the calculation on it 6 months ago in a different context before this assignment existed. She had a solution. It wasn't simple. It required a calculation framework that nobody in this unit had seen yet. "I can take that shot," she said. Harris studied her. He was the kind of man who didn't ask people if they were sure. He decided whether to believe them. "Dolan's going to say you can't," he said. "He's going to say the doctrine exists for a reason, that the consistency threshold below what Overwatch requires, that what you're proposing is going to create a false confidence in operational planning. He might say that," she said. "Is he wrong?" She thought about the calculation. She thought about the years she'd spent developing it, the testing, the verification, the specific conditions under which it held, and the conditions under which it would fail. She thought about the honesty required to answer the question correctly. He's wrong about whether the shot is makeable, she said. He's not entirely wrong about the risk of false confidence if the conditions aren't understood correctly. The calculation has specific parameters. If someone applies it outside those parameters, they'll miss. She paused. Which is why the demonstration needs to include the boundary conditions, not just the shot. Harris was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Can you brief it?" "Yes." To Farber and Dolan in the same room? She understood what he was asking. "Yes, sir." Harris looked at her for one more moment. Then he nodded. 5 days, he said. Don't give Dolan anything he can use. She was already thinking about what she needed. She was already 3 moves ahead. She found Morse in the equipment room that afternoon. He was running a maintenance check on his scope, and he looked up when she came in with the particular alert stillness of a man who had been waiting for something to happen and was calibrating whether this was it. She told him about the demonstration. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The 1300 shot at altitude. Yes, I've been running that calculation for 2 years. I'm hitting it 40% of the time." "I know your numbers," she said. "Your calculation framework is correct at standard elevation. At altitude, the thermal layering creates a secondary variable in the drag coefficient that the standard model treats as noise. It's not noise." Morse set down the scope. He looked at her with the specific expression she'd seen once before, in the equipment room with the whiteboard, the expression of a man who is genuinely listening because what he's hearing changes something real. "Show me," he said. She showed him. It took longer this time. The altitude calculation was more complex, and she walked him through every step, every assumption, every condition under which it would and wouldn't apply. Morse asked good questions. He asked the kind of questions that told her he was stressed, testing the logic, not looking for reasons to dismiss it, and the distinction mattered. At the end of it, he said, "This is going to work. Yes, Dolan's going to say it won't. I know." Morse picked up his scope. He held it for a moment, then set it down again. "I want to be on your spotter team for the demonstration," he said. She looked at him. "That'll cost you something with Dolan." "Probably." He said it without drama. The way men in those environments say things that are true and costly and have already been decided. "I've been in this unit for 5 years," he said, "and I've been failing that shot for 2 years. If you've got the solution, I want to be there when it works." She said, "You'll be there when it works." The 4 days before the demonstration were the hardest of her time at Bragg, not because of the preparation which she could do in her sleep, but because of the specific social weather of a team that is watching something it doesn't know how to categorize. Dolan moved against her the way she had come to understand he would, through the scheduling, through the equipment allocation, through the comments he made in the break room in a voice calibrated to carry without being formally addressable. She heard fragments. Theoretical. Works on paper. Hasn't seen what happens when the wind goes non-linear at altitude and you're the only thing standing between your team and a compromised position. That last one she actually thought about. Because he wasn't entirely wrong about what the stakes were. He was wrong about her capacity to meet them, but he wasn't wrong that the stakes were real. She had been thinking about those stakes since before she arrived. She was thinking about them now. On the 3rd day, Grant appeared at her workspace. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee, and he set one down in front of her with the careful neutrality of someone performing a small act of solidarity and hoping it would be understood correctly. She understood it correctly. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He started to leave, then stopped. "Sergeant Dolan's briefing log from last week," he said, without looking at her. "The one from the day you hit 15 for 15. He noted it as 12. She was very still. 12. In the official assessment record. Grant kept his voice neutral, the flatness of someone delivering information and declining to add the editorial. "I thought you should know." She looked at the coffee. She looked at the door. She thought about the official assessment record and what it meant if the number in it was wrong. She thought about what it meant that Grant had told her. "Thank you." she said again, and meant it differently the second time. She went directly to Harris. He was in his office, and she came in without knocking, which she almost never did, and he looked up from his desk with the particular alertness of a man whose spatial awareness includes the emotional temperature of everyone who enters a room. She told him about the log. Harris was quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet that isn't passivity, but the opposite of it, the stillness of a man organizing what he knows into something he can act on. "You're telling me the official assessment record is incorrect," he said. "Yes, sir. And you have your own documentation." "I do. Shot by shot, time-stamped round count, impact point, conditions. I've kept it since day one." Harris looked at her. His expression told her nothing and everything. "Why?" he said. "Why from day one?" She thought about what to say. She thought about the honest answer and the strategic answer and decided they were the same answer. "Because I knew the record would matter," she said. "I've been in this position before. Not here, at a different unit in a different context. The documentation didn't exist then. I learned from that." She paused. "The flags I didn't write down 3 years ago didn't protect anyone. The ones I write down now might." Harris studied her for a long moment. Something moved in his face, something that wasn't visible until it was, the specific expression of a man who has just understood something about the person in front of him that he hadn't previously seen. He said, "Give me the documentation." She gave him everything: the shot log, the comparative data, the original assessment numbers against Dolan's official record. Harris read it with the completeness that she had come to associate with him. Actually reading, actually processing, not skimming for the conclusion. When he finished, he set it down and said, "This goes to Farber before the demonstration." She nodded. "That's going to create a personnel situation," he said. "Yes, sir, with a sergeant who has been in this unit for 7 years. I know." She held his gaze. "I'm not trying to destroy Dolan's career. I'm trying to make sure the record says what happened." Harris looked at her steadily. Then he said, "The documentation you kept, the 3-year flags you mentioned, I'd like to see those too." She was quiet for a moment. "They're in my personal archive," she said. "I have them with me." Harris was quiet. Then, "Of course you do." There was something in his voice that was almost, not quite, the beginning of a smile. Farber arrived the morning of the demonstration with one other evaluator, a Major Torres whose background was in precision fire doctrine, which meant she was the specific audience that mattered most, and the specific audience that would be hardest to move. Torres had developed the existing doctrine. Torres believed in it. Torres was going to come in wanting to see it confirmed. Callahan knew this because Harris had told her. He had told her the evening before, briefly and without ceremony, standing in the hallway outside the operations room with the specific directness of a man who has decided to give someone the information they need to do the job. "Torres is the one you have to show," he said. "Not Farber. Farber already wrote something in that notebook of his. Torres hasn't written anything yet." She stood in the East Range at 07:52, 8 minutes before the demonstration was scheduled to begin, running the final environmental calculations in her head. Temperature at 52 degrees, falling. Wind from the southwest at 9 miles per hour with gusts to 14, which was outside her model's cleanest operating window, but inside the boundary conditions she had briefed. Humidity reading from the tower was consistent with what she'd calculated. Thermal layering at the altitude simulation parameters the range had set up with their elevation compensation rig. It was going to work. She knew it the way she knew things she'd verified 100 times. Not with certainty born of wishing, but with certainty born of calculation, which was the only kind that had ever mattered. Morse appeared at her side. He had his spotter kit. He said nothing, which was correct. She said nothing back, which was also correct. They had done enough talking. The rest was the work. Dolan stood across the range with his arms folded and an expression of focused patience that she recognized as something other than patience. He had been told about the documentation. Harris had told her that he'd been told. She didn't know what the conversation had sounded like. She knew what Dolan's face looked like now, and it told her everything she needed to know. He hadn't fought it cleanly, and he knew the record existed, and he was standing there waiting for her to fail so that the record would become irrelevant. She settled into the rifle. The simulation began. The first shot was at 900 meters, standard. She hit it inside a second. The second was at 1100, with a thermal shift between her calculation and the trigger press that she'd accounted for. Hit. Then the 1300-meter shot, target in partial concealment, elevation simulation at 9,000 feet equivalent, variable humidity. The shot that Morse had been running at 40% for 2 years. The shot that the current doctrine said wasn't consistently makeable. She ran the calculation. It was not the version of the calculation that lived in the official manual. It was the version she had spent a year building, and it accounted for the thermal, layering the standard model treated as noise, and exactly where to place the crosshairs, which was not where the standard table would have told her. She placed the crosshairs where the calculation told her to. She fired. The round hit the target, not close to center. Center. The range was very quiet. Morse said beside her, low and even, impact confirmed, center mass. She heard Torres make a sound behind her. She didn't turn to look. She did the work. Reset for second shot, same parameters, Farber said. She reset. She calculated. She fired. Hit. Third shot. Wind shift. The operator at the range console adjusted the simulation. The gusts moved from 14 to 19 miles per hour, outside her standard operational window. Inside the boundary conditions she had explained in the brief, she ran the modified version of the calculation. It took 4 seconds longer. She breathed. She fired. Hit. The range stayed quiet for a long moment. Then Torres spoke. Her voice had something in it that was different from when the demonstration had begun. Not broken open. Torres was not a woman whose face broke open, but open the way a window opens just enough to change the air. How long did it take you to develop that calculation? Torres said. 1 year, Callahan said, and 11 months of verification. A pause. The boundary conditions you briefed. Above 19 miles per hour crosswind. The model degrades outside that window, she said. I've documented where and why. It doesn't fail catastrophically. It introduces an increasing error gradient that a train spotter can partially compensate for, but I won't represent it as reliable above that threshold. It isn't. Torres was very still. Most people presenting a new methodology don't lead with where it fails. Most people aren't trying to put it into operational use, she said. Another silence, longer this time. Torres looked at the target 800 meters downrange. Then she looked at the simulation rig. Then she looked at Callahan. Show me the full calculation, she said. All of it. Tonight, if you're available. I'm available, Callahan said. Dolan said nothing. He had said nothing since the first hit. He stood at the back of the range, and his arms had come uncrossed, somewhere around the second shot. And now he was just standing, which was, she had come to understand about Dolan, the thing he did when he was running a calculation that wasn't going the direction he'd expected. After the range cleared, Morse walked with her toward Building 7. They walked for a while without talking, which had become, over 2 weeks, their natural mode. Then Morse said, Torres asked for the full calculation. Yes. He was quiet for 3 more steps. When I was putting that shot at 40%, he said, I thought it was me. I thought I was the variable that was failing. I spent a year working on trigger control, breath control, every mechanical element, trying to improve a number that wasn't going to move because the calculation underneath it was wrong. She said, I know. That's a year, he said, I know. He looked at the ground, then ahead. How long have you had the correct calculation? 14 months, she said. And you were where 14 months ago? A different unit, she said, where the context for applying it didn't exist. She paused. I've been carrying it to the right room for 14 months. Morse was quiet. Then he said, you're more patient than I would be. She thought about the flags she'd written at 23, the documentation she'd kept, the year and a year and a year of knowing something true and waiting for the moment when knowing it could do something real. I had good reasons to learn patience, she said. He nodded once, the way men in those places confirm things without ceremony. They walked the rest of the way in silence. The meeting with Torres that evening ran for 3 hours. Callahan brought the full model, every assumption, every boundary condition, every failure mode she'd identified and documented. Torres went through it with the methodical rigor of someone who has spent a career building doctrine and understands exactly what it takes to change it. At one point, Torres looked up from the documentation and said, this should have been in the system already. Callahan said it wasn't ready. A model that isn't fully verified isn't a contribution, it's a liability. Torres looked at her for a moment. Some people would have published it anyway. I know, she said. You didn't. No. Torres looked at the model. She turned to the section on boundary conditions and read it again slowly. Then she set it down and said, the shot you missed in the Dolan assessment, the 900-meter target with the short window. Callahan had known this would come. The window was 2.5 seconds, not 3, she said. I had the calculation correct. The timing was outside the stated parameter. The official record says 12 hits, Torres said. Not 14. The official record is incorrect. She slid a folder across the table. My documentation shows 14, time-stamped and shot by shot. Torres opened the folder. She read the documentation with the same complete attention she'd given the calculation. Then she looked up. 14, she said. 14. A long silence. Torres looked at the folder, then at Callahan. Her expression was controlled, as it always was, the professional face of a woman who had learned that rooms read the faces of women differently and had adjusted accordingly. But there was something in it, the particular expression of someone who recognizes in another person a specific kind of familiar experience, the experience of being right in a room that has decided not to hear it. The flags that weren't in the record, Torres said, you kept them yourself. It wasn't a question. Yes, Callahan said. Why? She thought about the real answer. Then she gave it. Because I learned early that in this work, truth without documentation is just a story, and stories can be dismissed. She paused. Documentation can't. Torres was quiet for a long time. Outside the building, the base made its ordinary nighttime sounds, vehicles, voices, the distant routine of a place that kept running, regardless of what was being decided inside one of its rooms. Then Torres said, I'm going to recommend formal integration of the calculation into the Overwatch doctrine package. She said it the way she said everything, flat and precise and without decoration, with your name attached as the developing analyst. Callahan said nothing for a moment. She thought about 14 months and the documentation in her personal archive and the moment 3 years ago when something true had not been written down and someone had paid for it. Thank you, ma'am, she said. Torres looked at her steadily. The personnel matter with Sergeant Dolan is Harris's to handle, she said. What I'll say is that the assessment record discrepancy has been noted and documented at the USASOC level. That exists now regardless of how the personnel situation resolves. Callahan nodded. She understood exactly what that meant. Torres closed the folder. She looked at the calculation model one more time. You said you've been carrying this to the right room for 14 months. She looked up. This is the right room. Yes, ma'am, she said. It is. The formal authorization came through at 0900 4 days later, a document from USASOC headquarters that ran to 11 pages and contained, in the specific language of institutional change, the acknowledgement that a new calculation framework had been validated for integration into Overwatch doctrine and that formal pilot implementation would begin within the next operational cycle. Callahan read it once, put it in her folder, and went to the range. Dolan wasn't there. Harris had handled it the evening after the demonstration, and Dolan had been reassigned to an administrative role pending a review that everyone in the unit understood was serious. She didn't feel triumph about that. She felt the weight of it, the specific gravity of a situation where being right came with a cost she hadn't manufactured but couldn't avoid. Dolan was a capable instructor. He had built real things here. He had also done something in an official record that couldn't be walked back, and the people above him had decided what that meant. That was between Dolan and Harris and the institution. It wasn't between Callahan and Dolan, not anymore. Morse was at the range when she arrived. He was running the 1,300-meter shot with a new calculation sheet that she recognized as her model, handwritten in his own handwriting, because he'd copied it himself the night after the briefing. He hit it on the first try. She watched him stand up from the position and look at the target and say nothing, which was his version of something large. He had been running that shot for 2 years. She had watched his face when he understood why it hadn't been working. She didn't need to watch it now. She already knew what it looked like. Grant appeared beside her with coffee. He was getting into the habit of that. She was getting into the habit of accepting it. The model goes into the training curriculum next cycle, he said. I know. He was quiet for a moment. He was young and earnest and had done a small brave thing when he told her about the log entry, which she had not forgotten and would not forget. What happens next? He said. She looked at the range, at Morse running the shot again, hitting it again, at the paper on the table with her calculation, written in another person's handwriting, which meant it was becoming real in the only way things became real, not when they were discovered, but when they were passed forward. Next, she said, we take it to the mountain. The pilot integration exercise in the Adirondacks happened 6 weeks later. 3 days of high-elevation live-fire assessment in conditions that replicated as closely as possible what the actual theater would require. Cold, wind, thermal variance, targets in partial concealment, distances that the existing doctrine had listed as outside the reliable operational envelope. Morse ran lead spotter. 2 junior snipers from the unit ran secondary positions. Torres was present as the USASOC observer, which meant the documentation of whatever happened would carry institutional weight. Callahan took the first shot of the exercise at 06:23 in a cold that had settled into her joints the way cold does above 8,000 feet, the specific deep cold that doesn't care about your gear or your preparation, it simply is. The target was at 1,320 meters, slightly beyond the demonstration distance, in a thermal layer that her model had not been tested in precisely this configuration. She ran the calculation. It was different from the calculation at Bragg. The altitude interaction was more complex. The thermal layering was doing something she had expected, but not in exactly the proportion she'd modeled. She adjusted, not by abandoning the framework, but by doing what the framework was designed to allow, which was incorporating live data into a dynamic recalculation rather than forcing conditions into a static table. It took her 11 seconds longer than the demonstration shot. She fired. The round hit center. Morse said behind her, in a voice that was as close to quiet joy as Morse's voice ever got, "That's the shot." She was already running the next calculation. On the last night of the exercise, the team sat around a fire in the cold mountain air, which was the kind of informal debrief that doesn't appear in any official documentation and is more honest than anything that does. Grant had come on the exercise as logistics support, and he was there too, sitting slightly outside the circle in the way of junior personnel who aren't sure if they belong in the conversation. She looked at him and moved her chin slightly, the small gesture that meant you can come closer. He did. Torres sat beside Harris and said very little. She was a woman who said very little when she had nothing to add and a great deal when she did. She had said a great deal during the debriefs. She had said almost nothing around the fire, which meant she was processing, and that was fine. Morse said at one point, looking at the fire, "The junior snipers are going to need time with the model." "I know," Callahan said. "I'll run the instruction sequence when we get back. Going to take months to fully integrate. Most things worth integrating take months," she said. Morse almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a smile she'd seen from him, which made it, in its way, the most expressive thing she'd seen. Harris said quietly, from his side of the fire, "You said the documentation from 3 years ago. The flags that weren't acted on." He was looking at the fire, not at her. What happened? She looked at the fire too. This was the thing she hadn't said in any formal meeting, any briefing, any official context. She said it now because the fire and the cold and the 3 days of doing the work correctly had made the formal distance between telling and not telling smaller than it had been. A shot was taken that shouldn't have been, she said. In conditions outside the reliable operational envelope for the methodology in use, I had flagged the conditions, in writing, 3 times. The flags weren't in the record that the debrief reviewed, so the conclusion was that the conditions had been correctly assessed, that the outcome was within operational variance. She paused. It wasn't, and the person who made the call based on that incorrect assessment spent a year believing they had done their job correctly when they hadn't been given what they needed to do it. The fire went. The cold sat on all of them equally. Harris said, "The documentation you kept is in my archive," she said. "Dated. It exists." He was quiet for a long time. "You've been waiting 3 years to put it in the right hands." She looked at the fire. She thought about the calculations she'd been carrying, the flags she'd written, the 14 months of a model ready, and waiting for the context that would make it real. She thought about the year before that, and the year before that, and the specific patience of someone who knows the truth and has learned to hold it until the moment it can do something. "I've been waiting for the right room," she said. "It takes a while to find it sometimes." Torres, who had been sitting without speaking for most of this, said, without looking up, "For what it's worth, Lieutenant, the room will be easier to find from here." Callahan looked at her. Torres met her eyes for a moment, and there was in that look the specific acknowledgement that passes between two women in institutional spaces when one of them has made it slightly easier for the other one to exist there. It was enough. The morning they flew back from the Adirondacks, the news had already moved through the unit the way news moves. Not through official channels, but through the human network that carries things faster and more accurately than any memo. The pilot integration had been formally approved. The calculation framework was going into the next doctrine cycle. The junior snipers were going to learn it. The units that would come after them were going to learn it. On the flight, Morse sat beside her and read the model documentation he'd brought, studying it with the concentration of a man who intends to understand something completely and has all the time in the air to do it. Grant, across the aisle, was asleep, which was the sleep of someone who had worked hard and done it honestly, and it was the most peaceful face she'd seen in 6 weeks. She looked out the window at the mountains below, the long white ridgelines, the altitude that her calculation understood correctly now, the specific geography of elevation and cold and wind that had been, before her model, the place where the current doctrine broke down. It wasn't that place anymore. She thought about the first day at Bragg, Dolan's laugh, the range going quiet after the first 5 rounds, the 15 hits that had been recorded as 12. She thought about Morse in the equipment room with the whiteboard and the 40% he'd been running for 2 years. She thought about Torres's face when the round hit the cinder block at 1300 and the wind was at 19 and the thermal layer was doing what her model said it would do. She thought about the flags she'd written at 23 and carried at 24 and 25 and 26. And every year after that, not with bitterness, though there had been bitterness, but with the particular conviction of someone who knows that truth without documentation is a story, and stories can be dismissed. And she was not going to let this particular truth be dismissed. She had come to Fort Bragg with a calculation and a folder, and nothing she hadn't built herself, and she had found the right room at last. And the room was going to remember her name because it was on the doctrine now, attached to the methodology that would go forward into every sniper in the program who came after her. That was the part that mattered. Not the demonstration, not Dolan's reassignment, not Torres's acknowledgement around the fire. Those were real, and they mattered in their way, but they weren't the part that lasted. The part that lasted was the calculation written in Morse's handwriting passed forward. The junior snipers learning the boundary conditions. The shot that had been failing at 40% now working because someone had done the math correctly and waited long enough to put it in the hands of people who would use it. She leaned her head back against the seat. Somewhere below them, at 1300 meters, the target was still standing. She had already moved on to the next calculation.